Hi, everybody.
Hey guys, good to see you. Well,
Hello.
from afar, it's always like I said in previous sessions. It's a shame that we don't have the personal experience, but I think it's great that we have people coming from all over the world, from all time zones. People that may not have had the opportunity to come to a conference because of practical considerations, because of finance. People that are presenting that otherwise may not be able to come, and the people that are presenting. So it's brilliant. You're kind of a fixed, what do you call it, a fixture of the type conferences. I have been known to call you the alchemists of type design because I don't know, every single time I go like, what the hell did they do now? It's like tiny explosions in my mind. It's like unicorns and gold dust and rainbows. Like, this is insane. This is insane. So I can't wait to discover what you've done now. You're always like diving into the technology and the software and the concept and ripping them apart and putting them back together. You go like, it seems like every generation of type designers has their people that advance the technology. We had letterer like Eric van Blokland just from Rossum in the 90s who were pulling apart PostScript, and now you guys are pulling apart variable font formats and doing crazy stuff with it. So where's Sammy? He has no reason to not be here. What the hell? Is he on a boat or somewhere? Okay. Well, it was nice to see. Last time he was there, I think. Wasn't he in Antwerp? I remember one of the rare times I saw him. He's kind of this.
He's alive.
Hello?
We can start if everybody is okay with it. I think I'm going to start the video so nobody touches anything because some.
Hello, this is our ATypI 2020 lecture. It's called Designing Bee. My name is Bas Jacobs.
My name is Akim Helmling.
And we're part of Underware, a type design studio in Europe. And our lecture for today is called Designing Bee.
The lecture also has a subtitle, From Y to B, which could also be written shorter, even shorter, or perhaps just with one variable sign.
Before we start, we're going back with a short prelude. We're going back to OpenType 1.8, also known as the variable font format, which was introduced 4 years ago in Warsaw, also at the ATypI conference, where some people like Vedat and other people, they presented a whole new font format. And at the time, it was actually presented as that the variable font is a single font format which includes or behaves like multiple static fonts. That was in the beginning how it was perceived and how it was meant to be, and maybe it's still perceived like that. And we think that's a rather, it's open for discussion, this perception, if it's really like this.
And the problem whenever you create something new is that there's a phenomena called the horseless carriage phenomena. And this means that whenever something new is created, you can only understand it from the old, from which it self-distinguished. So here you see a typical horseless carriage, which was the follow-up of the carriage with a horse, but just like with back then with a steam engine.
Yeah. But meanwhile, we already know, everybody knows that it's not a horseless carriage, but meanwhile we all know this thing as a car, as an automobile. But at the time, people couldn't mention it, name it as an auto, because they didn't know the word auto. They only knew a carriage, which was always pulled by a horse in front of them. And just like Kim said, when there's a new technology, there's always it's always it's problematic to see what it really is. Like, this is a very early telegraph, and the keyboard of this very early telegraph, it's a keyboard of a piano. And if you look closer, you can see that there are letters on top of it. So this was a keyboard to write, because the QWERTY keyboard was still to be invented. They didn't have a QWERTY keyboard. So you just take your existing technology and think that's what you need.
And the same applies also to this, like Die Schrift by Willem Flusser, a book of which Willem Flusser also had the idea to publish it as something which is surpassing classical ideas of a book. So he tried, or he published it as a digital something which he did not yet understand what it was. And this was then distributed as 2 floppy disks. And the most interesting probably is the instruction which came with the floppy disk, because on this instruction he calls this thing a nicht mehr Buch, which you could translate into a no longer book.
So what you have to realize that this was one of the first, or maybe the first ebook actually published. So until then, all books were published in a printed medium. And this was published for the first time as a digital book. And digital, the whole thing of digital book was just completely unknown at the time. Meanwhile, we think that it's just an ebook. And so if you look at new things, this is all what we know, and then there are new things which we do not know, and then we consider them from the perspective of the things which we do know. So if there's a new medium, so a digital book, we only can judge it by the thing, the medium which we know, that's a book. So therefore we call this thing a book, and that's a no longer book.
At least this is the only explanation what Willem Flusser back then could come up with, because he didn't know what an e-book was about. So the only thing what existed was a book and something which is not longer anymore a book.
Yeah. And in the same way you could look at the OpenType 1.8, the variable font format, that maybe we think we do not know what it is, so we just think we have static fonts, and maybe a variable font is just multiple static fonts.
And after the initial presentation was done in Warsaw, 1 year later there was a conference in Berlin, Typolabs. I think it was one of the first gatherings where people came together and tried to talk about variable fonts and what they mean. And our question back then was that just as the horseless carriage, after all, was not a horseless carriage but a car, something new, perhaps the same applies to variable fonts. That was the question, the initial questions what we asked ourselves. So in that way also, the same way as an e-book is something different than a book, and therefore the name no longer book is correct, but not like at the meanwhile we have a better name for it. The same, I think, could apply to variable fonts.
Yeah. So at this conference we presented, we had some reflections on this new font format, and one thought we had was this project ATMZ, and this is actually the consequence of a variable font. So you have a single letter, and the single letter can actually turn into any other letter because it's variable. But basically that changes the whole perception of what a font is, and in the end it could have consequences for the way we deal with text in general. But I think these questions are important to be asked, because if you don't ask these questions, then we would still be driving a horseless carriage today, which we don't.
We still drive them, but we know they are not horseless carriages, but they are something different. And since then, this was a kind of initial talk. After that, we did a lot of different talks, which all focused on this basic question, like what happens if a static font become variable, becomes flexible? What happens if an A can change into another letter? And half a year ago, we collected all those thoughts into a project which is called The Tale of the Tale. And The Tale of the Tale is also a website on which you can find all those investigations which we did during those 2 years.
So just visit the website yourself. There's enough to be said, but one of these URLs will work. Just we will figure it out. Okay, let's start at B. We all know this. It's a kind of paradox if it's a pipe or not. In the same way, what we have now goes for the way we deal with text. So last year we made this. So this is not an A, and then you can question if it's an A or not an A. And it's a kind of paradox. And if it's static on a poster, we can still think about it logically. But if this happens in real time with your text, it's much more complicated to be aware of what's really going on.
Yeah, like you could look at it from two angles, and those two angles, they are like in contradiction with each other. When we look at the form on top, we think that this is an A, but when we read what it says, under it, it says that it's not an A. So this seems to be a contradiction. And one of the probably most famous contradiction, which is also called the Russell's paradox, is about a small island where there's a barber, and the barber is shaving everybody who is not shaving themselves. And so the question is like, who shaves the barber? And the longer you think about it, the more impossible it seems that there is a solution. Because, and at the same time, or a bit earlier, Ernst Mach, he drew this self-portrait, and he said, like, that's the only self-portrait I can draw, because that's everything I see. That's what I see, that's what I can draw. And this is a portrait of myself. And if I would like to draw more, then I would need a mirror, but then it would not be a self-portrait anymore. So that's the only true self-portrait, what I can make. And it's interesting because this self-portrait later on inspired Douglas Addison Harding to create a theory of that perhaps we do not have a head. And the theory was then later on also published as an illustrated book by Richard Lang, and the book is called The Man with No Head. So Douglas Harding, big discovery of his life was he does not have a head, which seems to be strange, but Richard Lang, I think, was very good in explaining this theory. So next to this book, he also published a couple of videos on YouTube. And there's one, what we have here, short excerpt.
Put something in front of you and notice its color and its shape. It's a thing. Bring your finger down a little and point at something else and notice its color and shape. It's a thing as well. Now point down at the floor. I can see shades and patterns there in the carpet. Now point at your foot and notice its color and shape. It's a thing as well. Bring your finger up your body and point at your knee. You can see the color and shape of your knee, another thing. Bring your finger further up and point at your torso. Observe the colors and shapes there. It's a thing as well. Now bring your finger out in front of you and point back at the place where others see your face, the place you're looking out of. What do you see here? Do you see your face? Do you see your eyes, your cheeks, your mouth? Do you see any colors or shapes here? Do you see anything here at all? I'm not asking you what you believe is here. I'm asking you to put aside belief and take a fresh look. Rather than what you think is here, what do you see here? Or not see, in fact?
So actually this explains this book, and this explains if you have a different perception of what a self-portrait is, then you can also solve the Russell's paradox. So what Ludwig Kaufmann said is that basically it's very simple who shaved the barber, because if the barber looks in the mirror, he's not shaving himself anymore.
The barber can shave himself because the barber realized I don't have a head. So I don't have a problem by shaving myself because I don't have a head.
Yeah.
That's the simple solution of the whole paradox.
Then the whole problem is gone. And that's often the problem, that we try to solve our problems with the same mindset as what we already had when those problems started to exist. So we just have to change our mindset, and then we can solve any problem. And that's basically what we tried to do half a year after, 1 year after the introduction of variable fonts. It started basically very simple, like if one letter can be any other letter, then you can change any word into any other word. And this is not an A. If you turn this poster into a digital version, then you can have this and you still have the same letter. So it's not an A, but it's also maybe not a B. We don't know anymore what kind of letter it is. So I think it's important to reflect on the current developments while being active as a type designer.
So the solution of the paradox, what we showed earlier, lies within a new perception of what a letter may be. And this example of this calligraphic transition of one letter into another, we showed for the first time at Patras in Greece in April 2019. And at the same conference, we also published a small book, which was called From Typography to Grammatography. And within these books, like we do it more often, that we publish little texts, we also try to think about problems on a very general way, without directly thinking about solutions. And one thought within this book was, would it be possible that there is a letter which can become any other letter? And this letter, this is described in this book, and we called it in this text, the Y.
So we turned Y into a project. And if you look at the letter Y, first thing you will notice that there are 3 strokes, and it's actually kind of crossing. And maybe you can try to find a way that all these 3 strokes, they are visible in every letter. That every letter is constructed out of these 3 strokes. But it's a thought. You don't know. You have to sketch it, do a lot of sketching. And then at a certain moment, you will figure out that some letters are built up out of 2 strokes, 3 strokes, maybe 4, but maybe you can find a way that every letter is built up out of 3 strokes. So, after lots of sketching, putting them on top of each other, you will come up with 3 strokes, like this is one, that's another one, and that's another one. And basically what we think is that maybe with these 3 strokes, we can create any letter. But yeah, it needs much more sketching, and then in the end you will find out, you come up with 3 proto shapes for the B. And these 3 proto shapes allow us to make any kind of letter.
So just to be clear, those proto-shapes were not designed to be letters on themselves, but more like to be proto-shapes to create all other letters. So once you put them on top of each other, and you select certain parts of those 3 proto-shapes, you can create all other letters. At least A till Z.
In this case, A till Z. If you just select a certain part of every stroke, then you can have A, you can have B, and basically you can have A till Z with just building all of these strokes. If you want to see a whole animation, you can go to grammatographical, and it's rendered live there in the browser.
But of course it's not an animation, it's like a real font.
Yeah.
What you see there.
Yeah. So it's not pre-recorded and fixed in After Effects, but it's just a font. Yeah, it's just
a dynamic font.
A dynamic font. We spent quite some time in building this and figuring out the shapes and the whole technical side behind it. And we're happy that it got recognized by people. That it's like, oh, that could be interesting. So we got some awards in the world. And then last year we went to Tokyo, also to the ATypI conference, and there we had a small exhibition in the print gallery. And the challenge, of course, there was that in Japan, with the They sometimes use letter, but mostly hiragana, katakana, kanji characters. So we were curious if we could combine the hiragana characters, if we could build hiragana characters with Y as well. So if Y would not be limited only to Latin. And
So in that way, we made something with Y for what Y was not built for. And to make this possible, we had a little editor, and this editor allowed us also to rotate those strokes. But again, Y was not designed in that way and for that purpose, so we were surprised that it was possible. And to our even bigger surprise, it was also even possible to make small pictograms or emojis or whatever you want to call them. And because everything is based on the same 3 strokes, we can animate everything, or not animate, but change everything fluently one into another. So this character can then be animated or changed into a real character in letter A, for example.
yeah. So this is the editor which we originally made for to see if we figure out if we can make Japanese or hiragana characters with it. And once you experience that these strokes can vary into anything else, of course, you start to draw anything else. So this is a cup of tea from a Chinese person. This might be a cup of coffee from a hipster. And it's important to realize that these are still the same 3 strokes. It might look like an emoji suddenly, but it's just 3 strokes which are changing their shape and their length. And actually that brings us to B. B is the next project, and B actually continues where Y stopped. So we took Y as a starting point to figure out if we can actually realize a single letter which can represent all these letters, what are the possibilities. And we found some limitations, so we took took this experience to start with a new project which is called B. And now, for sure, some people wonder, like, what the hell just happened? It was a screencast, and this is basically when you design it, you don't only design the letter or the shape, but you design also the instrument which is controlling the letter. So you saw that it was called a Pencilman, and you can imagine that if you do this on a QWERTY keyboard, it's pretty hard to have this result. So instead of having a normal computer with a QWERTY keyboard, you probably need another instrument to control this new kind of letter. So here's a very brief overview of how such a Pencilman should look like. On the left, you see two hands, which are controlling it. Then you have some a web app, and then on the right, this is what you just saw. But this is basically the setup of the whole B together with the Pencilman.
And I think the most important is to realize that the input device is not a keyboard anymore, but it's a touchboard, and the touchboard allows us to read out lots of different information out of your fingertips. And based on this information out of your fingertips, we can create all these different stroke-based letters. That's what it is.
And then, just to make it a little bit more clear, because some people think like, yeah, this new letter, this B, looks exactly the same as Y. It's rather different. You will see here the biggest differences. It's cubic, grammatical. One has 3 strokes, the other one is 1 infinity stroke. That's a very big difference. You could also see in the movie it has a weight axis, so you can go from very thin to very thick, which is a new part. And there's a different way how it is controlled by the person who writes with it.
Yeah, while we designed Y, we encountered lots of things, problems, challenges which we did not expect in the beginning, which we did not even think of, and which asked for a total new project to solve those problems in a more elegant way. So that's basically what B is about, to try to fix all those mistakes what you did for Y, or to make those things much better, which were not very nicely solved in Y.
Well, we explain a few of these differences in detail now. To start with, there's a difference in the format and the way of working. Like this is when you make a variable font a rather traditional way. You have design space, and then you have some masters in there. Then you make in terminal, and then you can generate your variable font. However, with B, there are more than 1,500 masters already. So that requires a completely different approach to making your design space there.
At least that was the amount what we calculated would be required to get the functionality out of B what we wanted to have. So you make the calculation, and then it tells you like you have to design 1,686 masters, and once you put this in the perspective of the classical design space approach, this makes it very difficult, because this would mean that if you have the outline data and the design space, and then you want to generate this font with a font make into a variable font, you would need to have like 1,685 masters, and of course it's a very large number, and we cannot design so many masters. That's not possible. So instead of that, we thought of a new way to create it, just because pure out of it was required. And so we created a kind of master UFO file in which all information was built inside, which was required to generate the final font. And this master data file we used combined with a simple design space and font make to create a basic variable font. And this basic variable font doesn't have any dynamic functionality. It doesn't have any deltas included. So for all the deltas, for all the whole gvar table then gets generated by a different program, what we made ourselves. And so gvar make generates all the data, which is generates the whole gvar table. And once we have the gvar table and we have this kind of simple variable font, we can just merge them with ttx. And once you look at this workflow, you realize you can only merge this a gvar table with a simple variable font with TrueType outlines if your gvar table is also based on the same TrueType outline data. So this means that your initial master UFO file should also be created as a TrueType, based on TrueType outline data and not on PostScript. So this makes it very different, because normally, of course, we also draw all our fonts with cubic Béziers, but here it's really required to work with the quadratic Béziers. Otherwise, you cannot merge this GVAR table with the verbal font.
And simply said, it's important to realize that you don't always need to make all your masters manually and then put those in the design space. There are more possibilities to work, to approach masters inside the design space. What you also see in B, actually also in Y, is that it's interpolated, non-linear on a curve, and you have a certain kind of motion in there. So same as what you write, like you have different kind of speeds. If you go in a straight line, you go faster. If you go up, you have a different speed than when you go down. So the whole dynamics of writing, so the direction and also the curvature, they are included already in this interpolation.
Yeah, that was also the change in perspective while we were working on Y. There we were initially very much focused to get the points at least moving on curves. We were very happy by achieving that. But later on we realized it's not only important to make them move on curves, but it's also important to make them move in different speeds.
Yeah, actually, we want to control the speed, how things move. Yeah, and it's not only relevant for animated fonts or for writing fonts, but it's also relevant for very, I would say, old-fashioned verbal fonts.
Classical.
If you, for example, if you have a verbal font which has a thin, a regular, and a black, then maybe the only thing which you want to have slightly different in the regular is that the crossbar of the piece is slightly thicker. You could insert a new master for this, but you basically don't want that. You only want to tell in the interpolation, like, okay, when you have the crossbar, just move a little bit faster in the beginning if you go from thin to black, and a little bit slower if you go from regular to black. Or from thin to black. So there you want to control the speed of the interpolation. So on the left you will see the linear interpolation, on the right you will see the non-linear interpolation. Might look identical in the beginning, so if you look on the left top you will not see any difference at all. But if you look at the crossbar, you can clearly see that on the right the interpolation from the thin to the regular goes much faster than from the regular to the black.
So in that way we define the way the points interpolate on a point level, not on a cliff level. So every point, some points may interpolate linear, other points may interpolate using a velocity interpolation. And once we discover this possibility, you also discover that some things have to be done significantly different than how you're used to do things. Like, for example, if you look at a curve, and to be able to actually understand what's going on, it also needs a visualization. And we all know, like a speed punk, which is a very nice, good, great interpolation for visualizing the curvature. We also, at a certain moment, saw the need to visualize this speed of a curve. And the speed of a curve would mean that if you have a curve and you make 100 steps, then the amount of distance you travel through every step may be different. That's how I can explain it. And in that way, if you have a curve and you draw with cubic or quadratic Béziers, doesn't matter. There's always a different possibility to get the same static curve by placing the points differently. So, for example, this one is a very stupid positioning of points. Everybody would say that if you do that, that's totally, you should not do it. You should do it like it's at the bottom. But once you also want to have the velocity interpolation, if this starts to matter, you will see that if you look at the velocity interpolation which gets generated by this data, it's quite different on the top than on the bottom. On the bottom, it's rather fluent. On the top there's an abrupt change at the top part. And this is something you would like to, there can be situations where you specifically would like to have this interpolation to go that way.
Sounds maybe a bit maybe unusual, but the principle is very simple. Here you see 4 lines, and then you can see, for example, the third line, it has first off-curve point very close to the first on-curve point, and the other off-curve point is very far to the left, which if you would animate this, then you probably will get a curve like this, a speed visualization like this, which is very different than the one on top, where the speed is completely equal across the whole stroke. I think this explains it rather well.
Yes, and at the end what you want to have is that the user wants to have a font where he just slides at the same speed from 0 to 1000, and the change of speed is built within the font, and that's what you achieve here. That the way the points move, the change of speed is not required by the slider, but it's built within the font. And once you do that, you get this kind of dynamic interpolation, and the only thing what the user has to do, move the slider from 0 to 1000.
If you look at the strokes from B, then the first thing you will see that what we said, I think we said it before, that it's an infinite loop. So instead of having 3 separate strokes, we now have an infinite loop, which is visualized here. You can also see that the speed, this varying speed, is included already in here. So on top there, it goes a little bit slower, and then it goes a little bit faster again. And with this stroke, with this basic, let's say, master shape, we can make any letter which what we want.
And the reason why B only requires 1 stroke, while Y required 3 different strokes, is simply because we started with the idea that we will also be able to rotate this stroke, which gives you much more possibilities. And here you see that we have this 1 infinity stroke, and once we use it 3 times, we can create all letters. But we can create them because the loop was designed specifically to be able to do that.
And for those who look very, very carefully, they start to wonder, like, okay, what happens if with the white stroke, if it moves from one letter to the other letter, is it always the same? Or those people, especially for you, you should look at the white shape. It was at the right bottom of the B, but then at a certain moment, this Y shape is at the left of the B, and it can also be on the right top of the B, and this completely depends on the context of the previous and the following letter.
Because B was also designed in a way that we can make much smoother transitions between one letter and another one. And to be able to do that, we have to be flexible with those stroke orders. We only have to know, like, this letter requires those 3 strokes, and just look how you can move or merge them or morph them the most fluently with another state.
We have to speed it a little bit up, so I'm going to continue very quickly. This is a rather traditional design space, which doesn't work for such a variable form. Maybe you want to have a design space which is much more like this, which is very hard to imagine how it should be built, or if it's possible to build it at all, but you should think about a design space in a different way. Yeah, the problem is when we have something which loops, like there's no beginning and an end. If you have like a light and a black, there's very clear like beginning and an end. So therefore you end up with this kind of design space, which is not possible. But there's different solutions, which we call the spiral design space. And if you think about a linear axis like this, where in the middle is a 0 and outside we go until 1000, you will realize that you can actually go beyond the beginning and the end. And that's the trick what we applied for B. What's also included in B is a weight axis. It sounds very simple, a weight axis. In theory, it is very simple, because normally with a weight axis you only move points from the left to the right, or right to the left. and then you just change the x value of a point and the y value would stay the same. However, with B, once shapes start to rotate, this doesn't work anymore because the x and the y value, which we just nicely moved, they change again. And this has lots of consequences for the whole font, how you approach the production and not complication. Come on.
The font design, and because of that, because of the weight axis, the required tuples you need in the font are growing exponentially. So you see that Y had a much more complex outline, but B has much more tuples because of this potentially grow of tuples, which happens once you also introduce a weight axis. And at the end, the total number, it was over 1,500.
Yeah. What we also encountered while making Y, like Y has this very, very, very long stroke, and B is a much shorter stroke. This is still an example of the weight axis. Here you can see that while moving, we can still change weight. But what we also experienced while making Y is that Y basically is a very, very long stroke, and B is a much shorter stroke, and this has influence on the precision of the whole cliff. Actually, this is the influence, and the closer to zero, the better it is. And this basically can be brought back to a very simple situation. If you move a slider from 0 to 1,000, some people think they have 1,000 options, or other people think you have an infinite amount of options. But what happens if you put your slider somewhere there? Can you put your slider on any position? And actually, there are only 16,000 possible values between 0 and 1,000 in the variable font. And the problem is that all these numbers, they are binary numbers. So you will see you can make a 546.69, that's possible, and 0.7529 is also possible, but 546.75 will not be possible to get there. This has consequences.
We didn't realize that this had consequences once we made the Y, because we could not imagine that a step of 0.06 units may be too big. But once you work with the font, you face situations where this numbers becomes bigger somehow, or gets perceived bigger.
Yeah. So a simplified illustration of the problem is that if you have a stroke of like this long, then there are 16,348 possible values in between. But if the stroke is much longer, so if it's much longer like this, then every step what you have as a possible value will be much bigger, of course.
And as we explained, with Y, we had a very complex outline because it was 3 different proto-strokes. The total length was 17 m square. And so with B, we tried to reduce this dramatically to make it move at the end much smoother, and therefore it's much preciser because it only has 7 m square as a total length of the stroke, as if of the infinity stroke. And if you make it really big in the browser, you can see that very clearly what happens. So here you can see like the higher precision with the lower precision. The white has a high precision, and the blue one has a lower precision. And then at a certain moment, you see visibly, very clearly those steps. And what we also got surprised of, and which is an ongoing question, is like how precise does our font data need to be? Like, do we need decimals for true type outline data, for static outline data? Is it required, or is it precise enough? And I think with outline data, the system we have is very good, But once you start with this kind of things and you start with dynamic shapes, you will see like on the top, the deltas are rounded to full integers, or both are now rounded to full integers, and you see very clearly that it's not that smooth. And to our surprise, some browsers support like the decimals for deltas and others do not. And I think that on the long run, all browsers should support the decimals for deltas. And yeah, we talked about this before, 1085 tuples for this font. At a certain moment, you also run into technical problems. And then you ask other people for help, and then those other people tell you like, hey, come on, like 1000, that amount of deltas and tuples, that's much too much, no matter how you look at it. And I agree, it seems to be a lot, it seems to be like a very high number.
Yeah, but then we come back to the horseless carriage. We think this is a high number because we approach it from the perspective of what we think a design space should look like, what we think a variable font is. But maybe we don't have the right perspective yet. So maybe this number it's completely irrelevant. It should be maybe 10 times or 100 times higher if we want to make what it really is. So.
And at the end, I think we just can have to look at the numbers and see at the current state of technology. And there it seems to be a bit strange that on the one hand, we can put like in a font like Zeitung, a variable font, over 3,000 tuples. It's no problem at all. It only gets problematic once we put too many tuples into a single glyph. And it's just, I think the limitation exists because once the format was created, we did not consider that those things could be made with the format. But what matters is we have to look at both and see, I believe that both have interesting aspects and they should both be able to be made.
Yeah. And that's a whole variable font family. So that's has all the weights in there. It has probably 1,000 glyphs for all these weights. And altogether, it only has 3,000 tuples, and this is only a single glyph, and already it has only half of the tuples. That should be possible compared to a whole font family. So maybe again, what we have now with this car, like it used to be a horseless carriage, maybe it still is a horseless carriage. We don't know, but we also don't know how it will work or function in the future and how it will evolve, what will come next. And this is still easy to imagine because this is what we have, this is what we used to have, so we can extrapolate with a variable font. It might be more complicated because it's rather new. It breaks much more to what we used to have 5 years ago. Short note about the format. With Y, we build a small editor to make those shapes. And by changing the position of all these sliders, you can control the shape what comes out. For B, we built a little bit more advanced font editor.
Yeah, the font editor was also required because with B we wanted to be able to make like full text, like what we also showed in the beginning. And then you need something which is somehow like a static font file. So in that way we built this editor, and it's a very simple editor which allows us like to make a character set, define a character set, and to define the positions of the stroke and the margins. So you see that if you compare, for example, the uppercase of B with the uppercase of Y, it looks much better. It's much better usable also for longer texts. But next to that, with Y, we realized that it was impossible also to make lowercase. And this we also really put in the design process, that we wanted to have something which also allows us to make something, some lowercase, which is acceptable, which is like readable, which is usable in a way.
So this is just a font editor where for every glyph you could control from this master shape which part of the master shape you're going to use and where you're going to use it. And this can be controlled with the sliders on the left, and then you can reconstruct or rebuild these letters. And you cannot build any letter because it will always look a little bit scripty. You cannot make a Helvetica with it because the design of the master shape doesn't allow this.
But at the end, you really have to consider that it's not intended to be used for static text, but it's really intended to be used in this dynamic text. So for us, it's also not totally clear yet what are the parts of B. Like on the one hand, we have B as a variable font, which is consisting out of these strokes. And then we use this variable font to create this data. But what you see here, those data, those glyphs, they are potentially included in B, but they are not yet defined within B. So I use B to create this, you could call it virtual glyphs. And this data we then export as a file, what we call the WAV file.
Yeah, a WAV file, it's a variable font format, and it's basically a very simple file. It's just a JSON file with a short description of how things should move. That's and it sounds a bit strange maybe to have a variable font plus some other data, but it's nothing new. So if you look, for example, if you have a contemporary variable font used in the browser, it's not only the variable font, you also need a little bit of HTML, CSS, JavaScript to display this B inside your browser window. So now the only difference with the variable font like Python and with B is that next to this comes an export file, a WAV file, to be able to control how this B looks like in the browser.
So in that way, there is not one variable font which is able to define its own feature variation settings. So they have to be defined anyhow by your JavaScript, CSS, HTML together. So in that way, it is usable in the traditional way, in the way variable fonts are used currently. And we just talked about this set, what you then can create, like the virtual glyphs, which then gets this WAV file. And of course, like if you look at it, just take uppercase A till Z, and then you consider that all letters consist out of 3 strokes, and then we have 78 different strokes. This already makes more than 76,000 glyphs just out of the strokes you designed and defined for uppercase A till Z.
Yeah, so if B would be a static font and only A to Z, we would, and we would not have virtual glyphs, but we have static glyphs, then probably we would end up with a font which has this 76,000 glyphs already just for A to Z. That's not what we want. We're a little bit out of time, so we have to hurry up a little bit. Last part. Postlude. In one of these lectures, which you can see here tail on the tail, we once mentioned that letters are actually shapes, and those shapes are defined by contours. And for the contours, they are built up of points, and that's for static fonts. But then with dynamic fonts, those points, they are based on interpolations, and those interpolations, they are again defined by points.
That was our perception while designing Y. And meanwhile, I think our perception changed a little bit, because we also have this new file next to it, this WAV file. And the question is, currently we have a separate WAV file, but perhaps there will be somewhere in the future new font formats which will allow us to put everything into this new font format. But yeah, we don't know. So we only know that we have something now which seems to succeed, or not surpass the convention of current font technology. And if you look at current font technology, it's interesting that on the one hand we have glyph table and the G-sub table, which allows us to contextually replace certain glyphs by other glyphs. And once we got the G-var table, which allows us to change the outline, there was nothing equivalent introduced to that. So if you look also at like all other like variable fonts, like for example at this situation, and you would have like parametric axis, which allows you to change the weight and the width and so on, and the x height and so on. It would be strange to have like 3 separate glyphs to represent those 3 characters. It would be much more elegant to have the ability to generate this with contextual glyph variation.
And this is a kind of logic which was completely normal and acceptable 10 years ago and 20 years ago when OpenType was introduced. Same way, but this was completely logic. If you made an OpenType font where all these glyphs are changing all the time, that if you type this word, you get 3 times a different letter, it means that you have to include all these different designs as a separate glyph inside every letter. But maybe the same way as Kim just said, but there's 3 different ones, why should there be 3 different glyphs? Same goes for these 3 different O's, why should there be 3 different glyphs? So this is what we do up to now, that we all design all the different glyphs and include them as separate glyphs, characters in the font, and then we make a long piece of OpenType code, not too intelligent OpenType code to access all those characters. But maybe we can replace all this and access those different kind of glyphs through your variable settings, and maybe the code could then, this whole OpenType code could be replaced by this.
So with this technology, we could actually use B in a way that if you type B, the contextual glyph variation would know like then the strokes would be positioned in that way. So in that way, what we probably would like to have is VSUB, which would be like a contextual substitution of glyph variations. But yeah, there's lots of discussion about that, like what should go into a new font format, what should go in like the next major update of OpenType, which brings us back to the beginning of the talk.
Again, in Warsaw, when it was introduced 4 years ago, the perception of this variable font format was very logically that the variable font is a single font file which behaves like multiple fonts. 1 year later, in Berlin, we presented the superfont. It had 241 axes, which some people said, oh, that's really a lot. And the superfont it's a font which contains all our fonts, and not any font already. It's all included in one single font file. So in that way, you could say that the superfont is a variable font that behaves like any font.
And then when we look at B, the interesting thing in B is probably that you can make lots of things with B, but you cannot make anything. Whatever you do with B also looks like B. Every character you draw with B will look like B. But it gives you a lot of space, a possibility to create your own characters. So in that way, we know that B is not a super font because it does not allow you to make any font, but it's something what we currently call a variable font. And in that way, you can ask if this variable font, if B is still a font. Or if how we will look at it 5 years from now, we don't know. The only thing what we do know is that at a certain moment people will make something which will surpass our classical ideas of fonts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I got nothing. I'm sorry, I got nothing. It's like, okay, whoa. To be able to process this, it's, oh, okay. This is way beyond my pay grade. Guys, again, it's insane. It's simply insane. We had a lot of questions. The only thing is that questions asked in the Q&A area is invisible for the rest of the audience, I think. I'm not sure. So I'm going to ask the questions and see whichever you feel like answering, because it's quite a few. Bas, don't leave us. We'll need everybody at hand. So the first question that came in was from Siva Kalyan, who asked, have you guys made use of Régent Plamondon's Sigma log normal model of handwriting generation? This sounds a bit like that, and it was from the beginning.
Yeah, I never heard of it, but we'll definitely check it out. Thank you for the tip.
Then Santiago Orozco, who does a lot of variable font stuff for Type Network, is asking, is gvarmake public? Will it be at some point?
Yeah, when you make a program like this, it's specially made for the typeface you want to create. So in that way, it doesn't make any sense to publish that, because it's directly connected to the typeface. So it's directly connected to B. What B does is generated by this little program, what we now call the gvarmake. So in that way, you can only the only use of this program is to make a font like B.
Single-use software. This is, wow, okay, that's dedication. I will check out further down. What else? Oh, yeah. So Siva Kalian asked, isn't this basically the idea behind French curves? Would it be accurate to say that you've built a better French curve?
Well, the French curve is this kind of spiral shape, right?
Yeah, this thing you used to design curves like architects use it, and car manufacturers as well.
I think it's something different. It's
somebody else. No, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I think. No, I think it's something different than a French curve. French curve is, as far as I understood what a French curve is about, it's like a method to help people to draw the curve, right? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think so.
And this is not a method to help people to draw a curve, but this is a way to draw the letters which we want.
Yes, I also believe that's right, if I understand the question correct. Also behind B, there is some craftsmanship where you draw the curves to achieve what you want to achieve at the end. So it's not, how you say, a tool to make any kind of curve, but it's like, I think it's the design of the font. But not sure if I fully understand the question.
Don't look at me. So Santiago asks as well, how were the axes linked in an additional table?
Yeah, I think the question was asked after half an hour in the lecture, and I think after 40 minutes the lecture lecture answered the question already.
Okay, yeah, okay. All right. I get it. That's why you said just hold your beer. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's hard, of course, because there's so many concepts in this whole lecture that when the questions come in later, it's a bit, you have to figure out what part of the lecture it refers to. So does it make sense to ask, oh, that's a question from Lawrence Penny. Does it make sense to ask other calligraphers to record their B, directed by you, of course, and then the existing parameters could be almost ready?
First part, yes. The second part, probably no.
Okay, and that is...
I think the challenge is if you want to create a proto shape which um, which allows you to build all the other all the letters, and it's not so easy. It's not done in a second to build a proto shape. So probably if somebody else draws his own proto shape, he will come up with a completely different end result. And then I'm afraid that the existing parameters will not apply. I'm afraid.
Yeah, if you do
that
that,
was-
you actually have to build it from the ground up again, because
Yeah, that was also a little bit the problem in the making of, that if you change something in the basic loop, you have to start all over again. That's
that is something. Yeah.
that was a little bit stupid.
It's like a Jenga tower of type design. Like you remove one piece and the whole thing falls apart. You have to start building again.
Yeah, it's a little like I think that's also what we underestimated in the beginning. That we thought that it would be much easier to later on change the loop, but once you change the loop, you have to everything changes again. It's not just a matter of readjusting the axis.
Yeah, all the moving parts are connected. So yeah, of course, that makes total sense. And Sandra Neyens asks, can you design other things than letters when you use B, for instance, objects?
It depends what's meant with objects, but the same as with what we showed with Y. With Y, you can make emojis, for example, or icons, or hiragana. The same applies for B, of course.
But then, do I also imply that you have to change your...
With an editor, basically, you can, with a stroke, you can make any kind of shape.
Yeah, exactly.
Not any, the shape, you can make various kind of shapes, and the shape will always look like a B shape.
Yeah, I think you have to compare it like also with the static fonts. You can make images if you like combine the letters in a certain way. And with the pen, you can make any picture, and with B, you can make like something in between. Like you can make a lot of pictures, but you cannot make anything. But it's always depending on the strokes which are inside B. Like it's not it's a specific stroke.
I think I understand the French curve question better, because actually your basic stroke that manages to design all these characters is actually this better French curve. So it's a much more intricate shape that you then use to assemble all the parts of the characters. I think that was what the question was asking for earlier. Can you reveal the order of the B? That's a question by Lawrence Penny.
like as it is a conspiracy.
I think that's what he means. What I see is Carl Crossgrove has an interesting remark, not really question. In spite of these limitations, this could be an amazing model for dynamic, efficient CJK fonts.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed. Yeah, and so Siva says indeed that was the essence of the question about the French curves.
That's of course why B also now looks calligraphic, because there you have the strokes. You know, in Latin, quite often, if you have like a sans serif, you don't see the strokes anymore. But the strokes are much more present in CJK forms.
So you could imagine that you have this B shape, but adapted to be able to create CJK, but that would be incredibly complex, no? I mean, there's so many variations.
Depends. You could, like, it depends how you approach it. If you do it manually, then like it will take as long as you know, like Latin. There we did everything manually. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you could also do it automatically. That's what we also did. Like at a certain moment, you just tell B like just do what you think makes sense, and then see if this is recognizable as a character. And that way, you can just let the program generate all kind of characters, and then you use character recognition, and based on the score, like it generates itself. Basically, that's what you can do. But at the end, I think it will not look very convincing. Like because once you want to have like all possibilities, there's of course like billions and billions of possibilities. So there you see that at the end, it is important that that the design is, how you call it, defined very carefully. That it does make sense. It does make a lot of difference if a stroke is like 10% different. It can make a character, like it can have a lot of impact on the appearance of a character. And you know, like when you have 10% of, let's say, stroke length or rotation or weight or whatever. So in that way, we did some tests with this automatic character generation based on random parameters. But I think, you know, as when you generate like billions and billions of random characters, for sure there will be some characters be useful, but I think we do not yet have those programs which recognize the best characters.
Yes.
You know, like that's always the problem, that if the character recognition tells you like, yeah, this is 100% the A, and you look at it, then probably it looks like an awful A. It looks like recognizable as A, but it doesn't look as a beautiful A. So in that way, it would be nice to have a program which recognizes the beauty of a character. But yeah, this we don't have.
I don't know if you ever saw that clip of Miyazaki, who was invited at some Japanese AI firm who had created a program to create human form that would behave like human form, but the computer completely misunderstood natural human behavior. And he said, like, yeah, but this is an aberration because this is not a human form. The computer thinks it is, and it moves, but it's not. It's like a broken toy. So this is, of course, the limitations of the computer. And what I like about generation of characters, it reminds me of what they use in cinema when they do CGI, huge crowds. Instead of trying to have everybody behave in a certain way, they just let the software loose and they kill off anybody who doesn't behave like it's supposed to. But that would, of course, like you say, if you have so many options, trying to find the correct ones and remove the unwanted ones would take, I don't know what. I mean, is a computer able to recognize it? We could still have our own perception, of course. And I think we're through the questions. I'm going to check. Yes. All right. That was, yeah, I saw a lot of mind-blown emojis. Anything you want to add, Bas or Akim?
No, just thank you for ATypI for hosting this online conference. It's always a challenge to get this organized and get this smoothly running everywhere. And it's not so easy. So thank you for everybody involved for making this possible.
Yeah, thank you very much for the organization. And also thank you to all people who stayed up till 12 o'clock.
I woke up at 7 o'clock in the morning in Japan.
Yeah, it's 24 hours, so you don't know which time zones people are in. But thank you so much for, again, joining your amazing ideas and concepts. Everybody's thanking you in the comments. There's one last question. I don't know if anybody, virtual reality plus B, any thoughts? One last one to just leave the room. Be in virtual reality? That's crazy. You know what? If people want to continue the conversation, I don't know if you still have some time. We have the Hangout space where people can join and engage in conversation. I don't know if anybody wants to go, either the people attending or you two. I don't know what your plans are. But anyway, people who feel like it, who still don't want to go to sleep, or it's early morning for them if they're in Asia, just go over to the Hangout space where we can have more discussions. And other than that, again, thank you so much for this presentation. It was, yeah, mind-blowing. So, yeah, see you next time. And
thank you very much. And bye-bye.
Bye-bye.